Welcome to Harmony Enterprise Database Imports. In this video, we will show you how to make a connection to a source database in order to import well data to a Harmony Enterprise project. There are some prerequisites before you can make a database connection within Harmony Enterprise. The first is that you must have permissions to import data into a Harmony Enterprise project. You'll see from the screenshot on the right of the screen that there are a number of import options. If any of these are grayed out, that means you do not have import permissions and would need to speak to whomever set up your Harmony Enterprise project to have permissions granted. You also need to have credentials or be able to access your source database. So if you're importing from a company production database, you must have valid credentials to be able to touch that database. You also need to be able to make an ODBC connection to your source database. This is something your IT department may do for you, and they may actually provide you with a DSN file or data source name file. But the prerequisite still exists that you must be able to find and use the ODBC connection to your source database. This is not required in the case of connecting to an access file, but you would still need to have access to that access file within the directory that it's stored. The last step is you need to be able to successfully connect to the source database. So if it's an access file, you need to be able to open it. If it is a SQL or an Oracle source, then you need to be able to use an ODBC connection to successfully connect with that database. All of the material covered today is also reviewed in our online help file under Importing from a Database. Now we will move into Harmony Enterprise to a blank project and walk through the steps of creating a new database connection. On the screen you will see a blank Harmony Enterprise project. And what we're going to do is create a new connection to a source file to import some wells from. So I'm going to navigate up to the Import menu and select Database Connection. And this is going to open a new database connection wizard. The first step is to actually create a connection. So if I click New Connection, it's going to prompt me to give it a name. I'm just going to call it My Company Database. And you have two choices. You can connect to an access file, or you can connect to a data source. If I select this option and click the drop list, you'll see I have a number of data sources listed here. Some are Oracle databases, some are SQL databases. Essentially, these are some of the types of databases I was alluding to where you need to have an ODBC connection to them. And I will come back to that shortly in the presentation. To start, let's go to an access file right here, simply because it is the simplest one to work with. And I'm going to browse and pick My Company Database. Now, before we actually import from this database, I think it would be a good idea to take a look at what's actually in that database. So because this is an access file, let's actually switch over to Access. So now we're looking at Access, and you can see that I have a number of tables here in the far left pane with varying names. And within each of those tables, there are a number of fields. In the well attribute table, I have things like the well name, common name, locations, country, and so on. In the production history here, historical production table, I have well names, date time fields, and a number of different producing fluids showing here. So just to get a feel of how the database is laid out, just a quick look here. You'll see there are a number of tables: oil properties, reservoir properties, wellbores, and so on. So now let's move back into Harmony Enterprise and actually make that connection. I'm going to close the access file. It needs to be closed in order to import from it. And let's click the Next button. Now on this page in the database wizard, it's the option to pick how your data is organized. So the idea here is your database could be organized in any way. There could be any number of tables. Those tables could contain some data more data, less data. The column headers could have different names, and we don't really know how that data is organized. Custom mapping is the default. This is a situation where you have your own internal way of organizing your company data in a database, and we are unaware of what that organization is. Now you'll note there are some options beyond custom mapping. There's IHS Markit views. I'll come back to this one. Aries, Field Direct, and something called Legacy Schema Mapping. This option only applies if you were doing database imports from Harmony 2016 v3. You are able to reuse your schema file in that case. You will need to set your units in that event. We're going to begin with custom mapping. So let's go ahead and click Next. And we get opened up into this Assign Mapping page. Now on this page, you start getting some what look like error messages. It can be a little bit overwhelming. What I want to do first is just give you the general layout of this page. So you'll notice that in this left-hand pane, there are two columns. One is called Harmony Enterprise Views or Destination. This is the Harmony Enterprise project. So what tables are in the project? What data is in the project? The other column is My Company Database Tables and Views. So this is the access file that we made a connection to. So these will be all of the tables that are available in that access file. Now on the right-hand pane, you'll see this is called Assign Incoming Columns. So what this is, it applies to a single table. What columns are in that table? So for starters, you'll notice that the Well Information option has a red arrow next to it. This is a required item. You must map some well information in your source database, your company database. So what I'm going to do is click on this drop menu, and you may recognize these names. These are all the tables that were present in the access file. And what we're going to do is pick the table called Well Attributes. Why? Because that includes attributes like the well name, the location, the country, the basin, and so on. Now I still have a red X. If I pick this table, as I mentioned in the right, these are all the columns in the table. So in Harmony Enterprise, all of the data that we think of as well information is listed here. These are all the columns that are available. In your table, called Well Attributes, there are a number of different fields. You must map at least an external well key in the well table. What do I mean? An external well key is our name for the unique well identifier in your company database. It could be an API, it could be prop num, it could be any alphanumeric identifier that is unique. So one well, one identifier. In this case, in my company database, in the well attributes table, these are all the columns that are available, and I know that my unique external well key in that access file is called well key. And you'll notice that when I map that, there are no more errors. At this point, I can actually go ahead and import data. So the absolute minimum requirement is to map a well information table that contains a unique external well key. Now, if I import at this moment, the only data that will be imported is the external well key because it is the only field that I have mapped. If I want additional data, what I can do is simply let Harmony know what data lives in what columns. So if I wanted to add an API, here's the API in my company database called API 13. If I wanted to add the basin, I can pick that from here, and so on. So any attributes that I map will be imported. Now, it's also quite common to want to be able to import production history. So in Harmony, we have a table called Production History. And in my company database, I also have production history. I need to pick that table from the available ones in the access file. And in this case, I'm going to choose historical production. And you'll notice that I start seeing some error messages again. There are minimum requirements if you map a production history table. And those include, as the red X's show, an external well key. This is the same unique identifier we were talking about in the well information table, as well as the date time. So let's go ahead and map an external well key. Now in my company database, I had a field called well key. Here it is. I'm going to map that. Note I still need to map the date time. So I'll go ahead and in my company database table called historical production, pick the field called date time. And you'll notice that now I can import. The next button is again enabled. I haven't actually mapped any production data. There's no rates or volumes mapped here, but I could import. The minimum requirement to import production history is an external well key as well as the date time. Now let's go ahead and just add a gas rate. So I'm going to pick the gas production rate in my company database and say next. You have an opportunity to merge incoming wells or link incoming wells to existing wells in the project. Now in this example there are no wells in the project, so this setting is not going to be highly impactful, but it is something available for future consideration and will be covered in an additional database imports video. For the time being, I'm simply going to select the external well key. It's going to give me a warning about changing my linking rules. There's no issue here, so I'll just accept that and we're going to click next. The next page that opens is the setup filters. Now in this page what you're able to do is limit the number of wells that are going to be available from the source database, your company database, for import into Harmony. What do I mean? You can use any of the well attributes, any of the fields we mapped in the well information table to include or exclude wells. So you'll notice that if I choose to add a filter, the only fields available to me are API and basin. The reason being, those are the only fields that I mapped. If I had mapped province or country or formation, any of those things, those additional attributes would be available for me here. So if I selected basin here and entered a basin name, when I select OK, it's created a filter where whenever the value in the basin column equals the value I entered, the name of my basin, those wells would be included for import. And any wells that didn't have that basin name would be excluded. This is an optional step. It's just nice to know that it's available to you if you have a very large number of wells, some of which are not of interest to you. I'm simply going to delete that filter and skip this step. In this pane, you have the option, again, to include or exclude wells. You can also sort wells on fields to make the ones of interest easier to find. So you'll notice that we have listed wells here on the left. There's a plot on the right, which is available as a preview. And there are some additional tools that we're going to review. So if I select the name of a well, then I will get a preview of the data. So if I want to see what any one of these looks like. Now we only mapped gas, so only gas is showing. Had I mapped other fluids, they would also be visible in this preview. You'll also notice this blue gear icon. If we had a lot of wells and we wanted to organize them based on a specific attribute, I can do that. And you'll notice that only some attributes that were mapped are available. So if you map text attributes like country, formation name, state, and so on, then they're available to you here. If I add one of those attributes over and say OK, then my wells are all going to be organized by basin, and I can simply go in and select wells within that basin that are of interest to me. Now you may have also noticed this all present and future wells. Let me just turn off that hierarchy so my wells are unsorted again and discuss this all present and future wells. If you were to acquire new wells, drill new wells, they would be added into your company database. In that event, you might want new wells to be automatically included with any future data imports. In that case, you would select this box. And what that will do is include all the wells in the database that are visible, that meet the filter if you have one in place, as well as any new wells that get added into the project. So it's a very powerful tool if your company database is constantly adding new wells into it. It prevents the need to go into the database import and manually add these wells in. You may notice an option here to limit the number of rows that are being previewed. If you had a well with tens of thousands of rows of data, it may take a little bit of time, especially depending upon the quality of your connection to the company database to preview this data. So restricting the number of rows gives you an option to just operate a little bit faster. It improves the performance when you have very large data volumes. Continuous time track is a feature used to adjust your data depending on your shut-in conditions. It's important to use this feature correctly as your volume and rate data will be influenced by the setting. The time track import is based on the following. If the option is selected, no adjustment to the time track is made. The start dates in Harmony Enterprise will match the data imported. If the option is deselected, Harmony Enterprise will analyze the entire time track. If the time reported between two dates is greater than a day but less than a month, a day is assumed. And if the time is greater than a month but less than a year, the month is assumed. I'm going to leave all my wells selected and click Next. Now there are a number of updating data options here. These only apply when you have existing wells in your project. So the idea is, if a well already exists, how do you want me to handle the incoming data? These will be covered in another database import video. There is an option to auto-calculate sand face pressures, again beyond the scope of this video, but that option is available to you, as well as an auto import, which again is covered in another video. If wells do not exist, if they're being added new, then these update data options would not apply. So all I'm going to do is click Import, and it's going to run through and import those 10 wells that I mapped for me, along with the produced gas and a couple of attributes, the API and the basin specifically. Now notice there are no locations on the map because I didn't actually map any locations. So here are my wells. If I go to the attributes, notice I imported API. I imported the basin, so if I go ahead and find basin, you'll notice that that was imported as well. And in the diagnostics, I will have produced gas. So creating a database connection is actually that simple. Now, what about all the other data types that are available to import, and what about that schema piece that I mentioned in passing? Let's go back to our database connection. What I'm going to do is edit it. So we're going to leave everything the same, the name's the same, I'm still connecting to an access file. And you'll notice that what I could do is go ahead and map extra production data if I wanted to. Instead, I'm going to make a new connection and show you how that might work. So we'll just call that our complete company database. I'm going to connect to a data source this time. And in this case, I already have an ODBC connection to a SQL database called Production History AR. Let's pick that one. Now, if there were credentials on the source database, like a username and password, then you could enter those here. This is something controlled by your internal IT department. If you had a schema on your database, this is a bit of a decoder ring so that you can reformat data on your database in a way that makes the handshake simpler to Harmony Enterprise. You may have one on your internal company database. Again, this is something that your IT department would be able to assist with. Quoted identifiers is beyond the scope of this video. So let's go ahead and click Next. Now, instead of custom mapping, I'm going to pick IHS Markit views. Why am I doing that? You may see the note here that says pre-configured mapping for Harmony views and tables. This means on my SQL company database that I picked, Production History AR, it's organized in the same way that the Harmony Enterprise database is organized, and this can be done with a schema. I'm going to click Next. You'll notice that because we are using a known schema, we already know what all of the tables are called. So here's the complete company database. All the tables in that database have been named the same as they are in Harmony. And within any of those tables, all of the data has the same known field names that we're expecting. So everything's pre-mapped. This is a very powerful way of going. So I'm simply going to click Next. I have to pick a well linking identifier. Again, I'm just going to pick my external well key. Next, skip past the filters. Let's leave all the wells selected. And we'll just accept the defaults for updating data options, and click Import. So now instead of connecting to an access file, we're connecting to a SQL database that contains all of our company well data, including production and a whole bunch of attributes. I'll click Finish. Notice that actually the status of these wells has been updated. Okay, and there are going to be a number more attributes available because they were all mapped. And if we go into the editors, you will also notice that we have reservoir properties included, the wellbore is populated, and so is the production data. So it's a really powerful way of getting data in from a company database without having to do a lot of manual intervention. This concludes our video on how to make a database connection and import data from a database into a Harmony Enterprise project. If you have any questions or looking for additional support materials, please go to ihsmarkit.com/support form and we'd be happy to help. Thank you.